For 100,000 years, humans have looked up at the night sky and wondered about those awesome points of light. What are they? What are they made of? How did they get there? They didn't have the technology to find out, so they guessed that magical beings had created it all. If you prefer making wild guesses instead of using observation, measurement and calculation, then here's a sealed box. Spend the next 10 minutes guessing what's inside and come back again at the end of this video. Because this video doesn't cover what we guess about the universe, but what we know, and more importantly, how we know it. How do we know where the stars and galaxies came from, and how old they are? The first person to take a stab at gauging the scale of the world around him was the Greek scientist Eratosthenes of Cyrene. He knew that on the longest day of the year the sun was directly overhead at Syene in the south of Egypt, but cast a shadow in Alexandria to the north. By measuring the length of the shadow, he could work out the Earth's diameter. But while the Earth might be spherical, the dogma of a fixed Earth still held sway, backed by a powerful church. Problem was, this didn't fit the observable evidence, especially the observation that some wandering stars, or planets in Greek, had very erratic orbits around the Earth. When the telescope was invented, these planets turned out to be very different to the fixed stars. But it wasn't until Johannes Kepler calculated the exact orbits of the planets that a model of the solar system at last fit the observations. His law of planetary motion turned this into this. In the 18th century, a transit of Venus across the Sun, timed at opposite ends of the Earth, made it possible to calculate the exact distance of the Sun, and by extension the distances of all the known planets. But that still left the stars. The easiest way to measure their distance is a system called triangulation, which is used to measure distant objects on Earth. With stars, the baseline is the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Take an angle measurement here, and 6 months later here, and just do the math. This principle was known in the 17th century, that their instruments simply weren't accurate enough to measure such a tiny angle. But in 1838 the technology had caught up. The Prussian astronomer Bessel found that the binary star 61 Cygni was an astounding 60 trillion miles away. It was a distance so huge that it had to be measured in terms of the number of years it took light to cross it, 10.3 light years. Our universe just got bigger. Triangulation only works for stars up to 100 light years away, but it was a start. Knowing the distances of these stars, astronomers could work out the relationship between a star's distance and its brightness, because closer stars are generally brighter than distant ones. Using this calculation, they could now estimate the distance of the faintest stars they could see. It was only an estimate, but our universe got bigger again. We seemed to be on the edge of a huge wheel of stars in space. While the brightness of a star gives us an estimate of its distance, confirmation comes in another trick of triangulation. In 1987, a star was seen to explode inside our galaxy. The exploding star is called a supernova, and it's very bright. As it happened, this particular supernova was surrounded by a huge gas cloud far out into space. The light from the exploding supernova raced across the gap, and 8 months later it hit the surrounding gas cloud. Cosmologists saw the reflected glow. We know the speed of light, so we know how far it can travel in 8 months. And that means we know the distance between the supernova and the gas cloud. All cosmologists had to do is measure the angle between the two as seen from Earth, and once again it's simple triangulation. We can work out the distance of the supernova, 169,000 light years. That means we're looking at an event that happened 169,000 years ago. Our universe was now huge. By simply observing and measuring, we'd calculated a scale in time and space that was far greater than Bronze Age people ever imagined. But one question still confounded scientists. What are all these stars made of? To understand the evidence, we have to understand the atom. There are around 92 different types of atom, known as elements. They differ in the number of electrons, protons, and neutrons they have. When an atom emits light, it absorbs the light of particular wavelengths. Each element absorbs a different set of wavelengths. We can see these absorption patterns as lines when we look through an instrument called a spectroscope. This one shows the spectral lines of three elements that were very familiar to early 19th century scientists: hydrogen, lithium, and oxygen. But when the French astronomer Pierre Janssen pointed a spectroscope at the Sun in 1868, he found a set of spectral lines no one had ever seen before. It was a completely unknown element. He called it helium, after the Greek word helios, the sun. The new element also showed up in stars, along with another abundant element, hydrogen. Inside this tightly bound universe, which they called the galaxy, astronomers could see strange swirling clouds through their telescopes. Some astronomers thought these could be other galaxies just like our own. In 1917, a supernova was seen to explode inside a cloud called Andromeda. Supernovae are usually very bright, but this one was quite faint. Using the brightness and distance calculation, cosmologists work out just how far away Andromeda was. 2 million light-years. That put it well outside our own galaxy, and triangulation showed just how big it was, about the size of our own galaxy. The universe, it turned out, extended well beyond our own cluster of stars, and millions of years back in time. American astronomer Edwin Hubble soon discovered that other galaxies were even further away. He also confirmed an observation that they were all moving away from us at incredible speed. Those furthest away were going the fastest. In other words, our universe was expanding, as if we were caught up in a huge explosion. How do we know this? I'll explain with a more prosaic example. When you watch a car speed past, sounding its horn, the pitch seems to change. As it's coming towards you, the sound waves are bunched up, so the horn seems to have a high pitch. As it passes by, the pitch suddenly drops, because now the sound waves are being stretched out. This is called the Doppler effect. Just by measuring the change in pitch, an observer can calculate the speed of the car and whether it's coming towards him or moving away. We can do the same with stars and galaxies, using light instead of sound. If a galaxy is moving away, the spectral lines will shift towards the red end of the spectrum. The opposite happens if a galaxy is coming closer. They move towards the blue end. So cosmologists could not only calculate which direction the galaxies are moving, but also their speed. If we reverse the course of these galaxies and wind the film back, space itself contracts back to a single point just under 14 billion years ago. The start of this expansion is called the Big Bang. That's as far as we've got so far in our understanding of the scale and time span of the universe. Research is now continuing to discover what happened before the Big Bang. Now let's come back to that sealed box. To the people who decided to skip the video in order to speculate on the contents, have you figured out what's inside yet? Of course not. Sitting in an armchair and making wild guesses tells you nothing. You're really no better off than the Bronze Age farmers who looked up at the stars and tried to guess what they were. Just because the Big Bang is the current extent of our knowledge doesn't mean we've reached the end of the story. Every time in history people thought they knew the scale of the universe, they've always been proved wrong. To me, the real story of the universe is way more interesting than myths and fairy tales. For 100,000 years, humans have stared up at the same night sky and wondered. We are the first people in human history not to wonder, not to guess, but to know. In part 1 of this video, I looked at our growing knowledge of the universe and how humans became aware of its scale in time and space. Now I want to explain what that knowledge tells us about how our universe unfolded, how the stars and galaxies formed, and how the Earth was created, not by magic, but by physical processes we know and understand. Our universe, which may be one of several in time and space, started with a huge explosion of energy and matter called the Big Bang. Neutrons, protons, and electrons rode in the wake of an expansion of time and space itself. After 380,000 years, the universe had cooled enough for these particles to come together to form the first atoms. Nearly 3/4 of them were simple hydrogen, just one proton and one electron. 28% were helium, which has 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 electrons. Cosmologists thought this cloud of matter must have been patchy, denser in some parts than others. Otherwise, the denser parts couldn't have come together later to form stars. Based on the state of our present universe and theoretical models of the Big Bang, they predicted what this patchy early universe would have looked like. Denser clouds are always a few millionths of a degree warmer than the emptier parts of our cosmos, so cosmologists knew that if they could look back 13 billion years, they should be able to see the heat imprint of these early clouds of particles. They'd have to find background temperatures from the universe's furthest reaches. The instrument that achieved this was NASA's Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe. It spent 2 years collecting data from 13 billion light-years away, which meant it was not only looking deep into space, but also 13 billion years back in time. Then in 2003, the picture was ready, and the world caught its first glimpse of our universe at birth. What you're looking at is a picture of our universe just 380,000 years after it was born, as the first atoms were being formed. It's like seeing the photo of an 80-year-old man just 19 hours after his birth. The red areas are warmer clouds of matter, the blue areas colder and emptier. Hydrogen and helium, protons and neutrons, drifting in a dark cosmos. The Wilkinson probe results were hailed as a scientific breakthrough. They matched the predictions perfectly. Over millions of years, gravitational attraction pulled many of these denser clouds of matter closer together, and the more dense they became, the greater the gravitational attraction. Just as a spinning skater spins faster when she pulls in her outstretched arms, each swirling cloud began to spin, until they became tight balls of rotating gas. Inside each ball of gas, the pressure increased. Whenever a gas is compressed, it heats up. So hydrogen atoms in the center of the cloud started vibrating faster and faster until they were crashing into each other at such high speed they began to fuse to form helium. Each nuclear fusion reaction is accompanied by the release of energy. The energy makes other hydrogen atoms vibrate even faster, fusing more of them, releasing more energy that fuses more atoms, and in a split second, a chain reaction. Like trillions of hydrogen bombs exploding at once, the ball of gas ignites. The first stars illuminate the cosmos. Early swarms of stars were also drawn together by gravitation, forming galaxies. The first stars burned for billions of years, powered by fusion. But a star has only so much hydrogen fuel. As the energy is used up, the star begins to collapse, pulling the gas ball tighter. Pressure and temperature increase until they're high enough for helium atoms to crash together and fuse. This makes heavier atoms, like carbon and then oxygen. With higher temperatures and pressures, even these atoms fuse until the star becomes a white-hot factory. The energy from these reactions is far greater than the fusion of hydrogen. Finally, the temperature and pressure are so high that the star explodes, spewing its contents into space. Often the shock waves throw these heavier elements against clouds of hydrogen and helium that have been dormant in space for billions of years. This cloud hadn't been dense enough to pull together under gravitation, but the sudden jolt from the exploded star stirs it. Now gravitation starts to pull the denser areas closer together. The life cycle of a star begins again. Only this time, things are different. This time, the cloud of gas is laden with heavier elements. Thanks to spectroscopy, explained in part 1 of this video, we can measure the proportion of the different elements in stars and in our own sun. Because stars have been forming since our universe began, we can see them in all their different stages of development, from their inception to birth, maturity, old age, and death. So we know the rate at which hydrogen and helium fuse. The proportion of the two elements tells us the age of the star. Our Sun is about halfway through its life cycle, which makes it about 5 billion years old. So 5 billion years ago, a nondescript cloud of gas must have come together in this way and formed a medium-sized, rather nondescript star on the edge of a very ordinary spiral galaxy. As it formed, the heavier elements in the cloud created rings of dust in orbit. Over time, these came together under gravitational attraction to make tiny rocks, then larger rocks, a process known as accretion. This isn't an extraordinary process. In our tiny corner of the universe alone, cosmologists have detected hundreds of planets, so there could be billions of them in just our galaxy. Some would be too close to a star and water would boil away in the intense heat. Others would be too far and water would freeze. But for any planet in an orbit between those two extremes, water would be liquid, just like on Earth. Within a few 100 million years, accretion had created a huge ball of rock that would become our planet. At first it was molten because of the energy of millions of collisions. Then the molten ball began to cool and a hardened crust formed over it. A few million years after it formed, the Earth was cool enough for water to condense, and over the next billion years, chemical reactions created replicating molecules that would one day evolve into simple cells. One of the most difficult questions to understand about our origins is this: how can life come from non-life? Since every painting must have a painter, how can anything so well organized spontaneously arrive from an early Earth that was so disorganized? Well, it's a good question. And let's start by asking why paintings can't paint themselves. Simple, because they're made of chemicals that can't replicate themselves. Same goes for watches or books or whatever other non-living object you care to mention. Animals and plants, however, are made of chemicals that can replicate themselves. There's no magic involved, it's just basic chemistry that's very well understood. So the real question is, how did these replicating chemicals come about? To answer that question, we need to go through a series of steps. If it's impossible for these chemicals to arise naturally, then let's see which of these steps is impossible. The first step involves looking at the primordial Earth 3.7 billion years ago. There it is, mostly wet, very warm, and with an atmosphere composed of all sorts of gases. Hydrogen, hydrogen cyanide, methane, and ammonia among them. DNA is a long-chain molecule made from just 4 different types of nucleotide. So the first question is, where did the nucleotides come from? In 1961, a researcher called Juan Oro left hydrogen cyanide and ammonia to stew in an aqueous solution in his laboratory under conditions very similar to those that prevailed on the primordial Earth. Left alone, the solution produced adenine, one of the 4 nucleotide bases that make up DNA. To make a complete nucleotide, these bases need to gain a sugar called ribose and a group of phosphates. Biochemists think they know how the phosphate group formed. They're now trying to find out how the ribose is attached. Once nucleotides formed, the next step was to join together to make chains called polynucleotides. In the 1980s, researchers found that a clay called montmorillonite, which was abundant on the primordial sea floor and in hot pools of water on land, is the perfect catalyst for this process. Some of these long polynucleotide chains, like ribonucleic acid or RNA, are able to make copies of themselves. The copies aren't always perfect. Mistakes creep in, but some imperfectly copied molecules would have been better adapted to the environment than others. These successful molecules continue to replicate and pass on their traits, while weaker or less well-adapted molecules would have broken apart. As RNA molecules replicated themselves, they shared their environment with other chemicals that thrive in montmorillonite clay. One group, called lipids, have a natural tendency to clump together, to form spherical structures called micelles. RNA molecules that attracted these lipids would therefore find themselves protected inside a micelle membrane. Because they were better protected, they better survived and replicated more successfully. There you have the first primitive cells. They look nothing like the complex cells we have today for a very good reason. Over 3.7 billion years they've evolved. I'll tackle the subject of evolution in another video. Over hundreds of millions of years, RNA grew more complex. The single strand became a double strand, and the better adapted DNA molecule evolved. One of the differences between RNA and DNA is that DNA needs proteins to replicate itself. Proteins are made of amino acids, which are often called the building blocks of life. So where did the first ones come from? A number of experiments using montmorillonite have produced not only amino acids, but long chains of amino acids called polypeptides. Montmorillonite, it turns out, is a natural breeding ground for all kinds of complex organic chemicals. It has to be said that this research is in its infancy, and current hypotheses are nowhere near as solid as the theory of evolution, which has been around for 150 years and has overwhelming evidence to support it. But the reality is a far cry from the idea that scientists believe life popped out of nowhere. Before I go, I just want to rebut a couple of hoary old myths that are often used to show that these steps must somehow be impossible. Really? But we know that's nonsense. Left alone, organic chemicals can and do polymerize to form longer, more complex chemicals. No, it doesn't. The natural origin of life doesn't violate any of the laws of thermodynamics. People who make that claim just need to read the laws of thermodynamics, and they'd see why. That's true, but neither has lightning if we want to be strict about recreating things through natural conditions. For a long time, nuclear fusion couldn't be recreated in a laboratory, even though scientists knew exactly how it happened in nature. Recreating something in a laboratory has never been a prerequisite to understanding how it happens. Nature had millions of years and a laboratory the size of the Earth to create just a few molecules that could replicate themselves. Given those odds, scientists aren't even trying to recreate life in a laboratory through natural means. What they are trying to do is find out how these primordial chemicals work, what they're made of, how they interact, and what sort of processes are needed for their natural formation. Biochemists have made huge advances over the last few years, and it's only a matter of time, perhaps easily within your lifetime, that all the steps that make up this process will be understood. Let's try a quick quiz. These pictures show the aftermath of 4 different disasters: a tornado, an earthquake, a hurricane, and a flood. Question is, which is which? Just pause the video for a second to figure it out. Okay, not too hard, was it? Answers will be at the end. But how do we know what caused these events if we weren't there to witness them? Make it up? Or do what you did with the photos and look at the clues that these events leave behind. After all, deducing what happened in the past is a process we go through every day. If we weren't there, we have to work it out by observation and deduction. Each sedimentary rock on Earth, for example, tells the story of how it was formed and under what conditions. Geologists can identify ancient earthquakes and floods just as you can identify recent ones. For thousands of years, Europeans assumed the rocks had all been laid down in the Noah's Ark flood. But in the 18th century, early geologists took a good look at the rocks under their feet and were amazed at what they found. Many of the rocks they saw were in layers and made of the sort of material you'd find at the bottom of the sea. Okay. But why were some of these sedimentary layers at odd angles, or on mountain tops, or bent out of shape? Why were the layers made of different materials? Underneath the top sedimentary layers, the picture got even more complicated. In 1788, the man called the father of geology, James Hutton, saw a geological formation that seemed impossible. At Sycamore Point in Scotland, he found this set of almost horizontal sedimentary beds sitting directly on top of an almost vertical set, and this formation wasn't unique. It's called an angular unconformity, and geologists soon found angular unconformities all over the place. By the mid-19th century, two principles had been established. It was clear that sedimentary beds that were once at the bottom of the sea must have been uplifted. Of course, the effect of these uplifts, and their opposite number, subsidences, are enhanced by the rise and fall of sea levels as polar ice caps grow and melt. But a rise in sea level alone doesn't explain how sedimentary rocks can be folded and lifted several miles high. Some unseen force was acting on them. Once uplifted, the rocks are subjected to erosion by wind and water. Silt, sand and mud are washed into the rivers and out to sea, where they're deposited, slowly building up the sedimentary beds that'll become the rocks of the future. So angular unconformities weren't that weird after all. The lower beds were laid down under the sea, with material eroded from the land. Over time and under pressure, water percolated through the deposits, precipitating minerals that cemented the grains together. Then the solid beds were lifted up and deformed. Now above sea level, wind and rain eroded the rocks, forming a soil at the surface. After a period of time, sea levels rose and covered the beds once again. More sediment was laid on top. Then the sea levels fell and the beds were exposed. Nearly every feature they'd seen in the rocks of the past can be seen in the deposits that are being laid down today, showing that this was a long and continual process that took millions of years. So early 19th century geologists had to forget their preconceived ideas. Instead, they followed the evidence. But although they understood erosion and sedimentation, the frequent uplifts were a puzzle. By observing and analyzing the rocks of the Appalachians in the 1850s, American geologists deduced that a deep trough in the ocean floor had accumulated sediment over millions of years and then been violently uplifted. They called this trough a geosyncline, and they soon found other mountain ranges in the world that had been formed in the same way. But they still had no clue as to what caused them. Then, in the 1960s, researchers made a discovery that transformed our understanding of the Earth and its geological history. The theory of plate tectonics concludes that we live on pieces of crust floating on partially melted rock as they drift around the Earth's surface. It's likely these crustal plates are driven by convection currents in the Earth's upper mantle. Thicker crustal plates, made mostly of granite, make up our continents. The oceans mostly fill the lower and thinner crustal plates made of basalt. In some places these plates are moving apart, and new rocks well up from the Earth's mantle to fill the gap. In other places they slide alongside each other, and elsewhere they collide, buckling at the crash site and throwing up huge mountain chains. Now the uplift could be explained, and it fitted exactly with the geosyncline model. The deep troughs were, in fact, the boundaries between oceanic and continental crustal plates, accumulating sediment over millions of years. As the ocean closed, it brought two continents into collision. Thanks to precise GPS measurements, geologists can now see the process happening. The continents are indeed moving at about the speed your fingernails grow. As Africa and Europe collide, the Alps rise about 1 millimeter a year. And as India and Asia collide, they force up the Himalayas 5 times faster. Plate tectonics also showed that earthquakes are caused by buckling and jarring along the edges of the crustal plates. So if we look at the Earth today, we see processes that fit perfectly with the rocks we find from the past. We can see and measure uplift, identical to the uplift of the past. We can see how material is slowly eroded and deposited, and it matches exactly the deposits of the past. We can even see the same patterns and layering of the rocks today as in rocks millions of years old. Sometimes the sedimentary patterns are repetitive, if, for example, deposits are laid down in a seasonal cycle. Sometimes currents are gentle, and the sediments show distinct rippling. Shifting ripples in stream deposits and sand dunes lead to a structure called cross-bedding. And we can see the result of floods. Annual floods, catastrophic floods, local floods, each type of flood leaves its mark and leaves clues as to how strong it was, how long it lasted, and what sort of material it carried. We can see a number of different floods at different times in the past, going back hundreds of millions of years. And finally, take a look at this place, the Peak District of Derbyshire in Britain. Several meters down there's coal, which is the compressed remnants of a hot, swampy forest. Go further down, past a layer of hard grit, and we find a coral reef, which means that further back in time this cold moorland was once a warm tropical sea. The reason is simple. The evidence shows that around 350 million years ago, the European crustal plate was much further south, and low-lying areas were covered by a warm coral sea. Then sea levels fell, the area became a river delta, and the coral was buried under sand and gravel. Millions of years later, sea levels dropped further, and the delta turned into a swampy tropical forest. Over the next 100 million years, the European crustal plate moved slowly northwards to its current position. So to geologists, there's no puzzle as to why we find the remnants of three completely different environments in the same location. It fits perfectly with what we know about crustal plate movements, erosion and sedimentation. Now let's go back to the quiz at the beginning. Unless you recognize these pictures, I can assume you weren't there when these disasters happened, and neither you nor I witnessed them. But just like the geology all around us, each of these photos has clues, and by using our frontal lobes, the reasoning parts of our brain, we can indeed work out what happened in the past. In the 17th century, a theologian called James Ussher worked out the age of the universe based on the chronology of the Bible. It was created, he concluded, in a week in October 4004 BC. Even today, millions of people still believe that this 17th century calculation is about right, and that the overwhelming evidence of geology, cosmology, paleontology, chemistry, astrophysics, geophysics, stratigraphy, and biology is wrong. So let's take a look at what that evidence is, starting with a principle that even creationists don't dispute. The golden rule is that newer sedimentary deposits are always laid on top of older ones, so except where rocks have been folded, this orange bed would be older than the green one, and the green one is older than the blue one. Geologists can then follow a single bed to make similar deductions in a different locality. The dark grey bed may be at the surface or even at a higher point than the others, but it's older than all of them, and the light grey bed is older still. What we end up with is what's called the geological column. To get the absolute dates of these rocks, scientists use a variety of different methods. I'll start with one of the easiest and most recent. We all know trees have rings because in summer they grow faster than in winter. But seasonal growing conditions vary according to the weather, so the bands will vary in size. Each time period in each geographical location has its own distinctive pattern of tree rings, like a fingerprint. So if we take wood of a known age, we can match the oldest part of it with the youngest part of another piece of wood, and so on back through time. Back 10,000 years, in fact, and already way beyond the biblical chronology. Okay, I'll spend a bit of time on this one because creationist preachers spend a lot of time talking about it, but don't seem to understand it. Our upper atmosphere is constantly being bombarded by neutrons from the sun. When one of them hits a nitrogen atom in the air, it knocks off a proton, changing the atom from nitrogen into carbon. But this is a heavy and unstable form of carbon called carbon-14, or C14. The normal form of carbon is C12. In the atmosphere, C14 combines with oxygen to make carbon dioxide, which is then absorbed by plants and into the bodies of animals that eat the plants. The ratio of these two isotopes in animals and plants is roughly the same as the ratio in the atmosphere around them. But when the animal or plant dies, C14 decays over time and reverts back to nitrogen. So compared to C12, which doesn't change, the amount of C14 falls at a constant measurable rate. By measuring this ratio inside the dead animal or plant, scientists can find out when it died. Before I look at other dating techniques, I'll bat a few hoary old myths about carbon-14 out of the ballpark. No, it's not. That's like saying cars don't work because sometimes drivers get lost. Carbon dating works fine, but if the wrong stuff gets analyzed, then you'll end up getting the wrong date. So if there's bacteria or mold or any kind of contamination on the sample, the date will be wrong. If the results aren't calibrated properly, the results will be wrong. And in some environments, carbon dating is impractical, so the results will be wrong. But when everything's done properly, the results are right. That's no different to any sophisticated analysis technique, from X-ray imaging to spectroscopy. Contaminated samples don't invalidate the principle of DNA analysis or chromatography or spectroscopy. We know they work, and we know carbon dating works. Firstly, carbon dating can be checked against artifacts of known age, such as ship's timber. Secondly, it can be checked by sending the same artifact to different labs for analysis. Thirdly, let's take a sample of organic material from each of these layers. If carbon dating was random nonsense, you'd expect the chronological order of these samples to be all over the place, but that doesn't happen. The results show each of these samples in its correct chronological order. The ones from the upper beds are younger, and the ones from the lower beds are older. Is this magic, or is it because carbon dating works, and that's why it's used? To quote Kent Hovind, samples don't come with labels attached telling the lab their age. Testing is always blind. If it's not blind, it's not science. And if creationists don't trust the carbon dating method, they're perfectly welcome to conduct their own blind tests to prove it wrong. But carbon dating isn't used on diamonds and coal, and for very good reason. As I explained, C14 is formed when neutrons collide with nitrogen atoms. The C14 used in carbon dating originated in the atmosphere. But you can also get it deep underground, in places where decaying uranium is giving off neutrons. Coal and diamonds are made of carbon, so you'd expect to find higher levels of C14 in coal and diamonds close to rocks that contain uranium, and much lower levels away from those rocks. And that's exactly what we do find. Carbon dating is only used and only useful for dating organic material in the topmost sedimentary layers. Now that we've got carbon dating out of the way, let's quickly run through a few more absolute dating methods. Biologists know that human DNA mutates at a fairly regular rate, and they can trace these mutations back, like following the branches of a tree back to the trunk. It's not a greatly accurate method, but it does give a rough idea of when humans migrated, and a very definite idea of where. It doesn't lead back to Mount Ararat 4,000 years ago, but to Africa around 50,000 years ago, just as other dating methods suggested it should. Every 250,000 years or so, the Earth's magnetic fields flip over, and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. Magnetized minerals within rocks show the polarity of the Earth when the rocks were laid down, so throughout the geological column, rocks show a regular magnetic banding depending on the polarity of the Earth, and that can be dated. Potassium-argon dating works on the same principle as carbon dating, but instead of carbon decaying to nitrogen, we have potassium decaying to argon. And instead of a half-life of 5,500 years, we have a half-life of 1.3 billion years. That means the method can be used for dating rocks and fossils hundreds of millions of years old. The technique has largely been replaced with the far more accurate argon-argon method, and there are other decay processes that can be measured, each with different half-lives, such as uranium-thorium and rubidium-strontium. Radiometric dating takes us back to the oldest rocks we found on Earth, 3.8 billion years old. If you want to go back even further, you have to look into space. My video, The History of the Universe Made Easy, explains how we can calculate the age of stars and galaxies, so I won't repeat that here. Just take a look at the video. What's important is that the results fit perfectly with the chronology we find on Earth. The Sun, for example, doesn't turn out to be younger than the Earth or older than the universe. Its age, based on the amount of hydrogen fused into helium, is exactly what you'd expect. And as with dating methods devised for rocks on Earth, the method for measuring the age of stars and galaxies is devised first and tested afterwards. There's no way of knowing in advance what age these tests will show, but every time the age confirms the known chronology of our world. As technology expands, new dating techniques are constantly being developed. If the world really was around 6,000 years old, you'd expect them to show it, or at least disprove the established chronology. But they don't. Every new technique confirms what we know. There's thermoluminescence that can measure the number of trapped electrons on the surface of volcanic rock. The speed that continents are drifting can be measured today, so their position millions of years ago can be calculated. It matches perfectly with the geological chronology we've already worked out. Climatic banding in sedimentary rocks can be measured, caused by a wobble in the Earth's motion every 12,000 years. I could go on, but there's no time here to list every dating method, let alone spell out the details of how they work. But if creationist preachers are so convinced that every single dating method is wrong, and that the single story they tell is the result of either a huge coincidence or a giant conspiracy, it's very easy for them to prove it. Hey guys, do your own tests. After all, a few creationists have university degrees in biology and geology. Okay then, devise a dating technique of your own choosing. Explain publicly how it works. Have it tested against samples whose age we all agree on so we know it works. Then go out and take samples of sedimentary rocks throughout the geological column and have them tested by the method you've devised. Not surprisingly, not one of the so-called creation science organizations has bothered to do this. Why not? If the Bible is right, then all the samples would date to around 4,000 years ago and provide strong evidence that the biblical flood was real. But if the Bible is wrong, then the dates will be much older, and more importantly, the chronological order of the samples will be in perfect accord with their comparative ages in the geological column. For some reason, so-called creation scientists, despite their professed faith that the Bible is right, don't think that's a risk worth taking. The one thing we all know about the theory of evolution is that it was proposed by Charles Darwin about 150 years ago. Well, not quite. The idea that organisms evolve was floating around for 2,000 years before Darwin and was revived a bit before his time by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. But it didn't gain much ground because there was no obvious mechanism by which one type of animal could change into another. Lamarck suggested that maybe animals changed because they felt the need to change. It didn't sound very scientific, and with no evidence to support it, the idea didn't go very far. What Darwin did was to show a plausible mechanism by which these changes could happen. And let's not forget poor old Alfred Wallace, who came up with the same idea and published it jointly. The paper they wrote was this. Darwin had come up with what he called the principle of natural selection. These days, we tend to call this the theory of evolution as a kind of shorthand, but that's confusing, because we also use the term theory of evolution to describe the fact that organisms evolve. I want to leave the physical evidence and the proof of evolution for the next video. In this video, I just want to look at the mechanism, to see whether, sitting in our armchairs and not doing a bit of research, we can predict evolution in animals purely on the basis of what we know, that animals replicate themselves, and that the replication isn't perfect. There's always variation. Just taking these two known facts and nothing else, what do we expect might happen if we keep copying a hypothetical animal generation after generation in a changing environment? Let's say the hypotheticus lives in a tropical climate, grazing happily on grass and plants. We know from our two principles that not every hypotheticus is the same. This one has been born with a slightly longer neck. This one has slightly longer legs, the third has slightly longer claws, and the fourth has a slightly hairier body. Over time, herds of Hypothetica spread across the continent. But the climate changes and the continent dries up. Only scrubby bushes and hardy tubers can survive. The Hypotheticus with the slightly longer neck can obviously get to more leaves than its neighbours. Inevitably, taller and longer-necked Hypothetica are better fed and fitter, and therefore reproduce more. A few generations later, the drought has caused overall numbers to dwindle, but there are more long-necked animals. But natural selection doesn't suddenly stop just because average neck length has increased. The longest of the long necks now has an advantage over ordinary long necks, and so the process continues. This principle is so easy to understand, you have to wonder why it's so frequently misunderstood. So let's take this one step at a time and see where the confusion lies. Surely no argument there. By which I mean children are like their parents and inherit their traits. For example, if it gets colder, animals with hairier bodies will have a slightly better chance of survival. Pretty obvious? Like genes for hairy bodies. Genes that don't confer these advantages tend not to get passed on because the animals that carry them have a lower chance of survival. So if each of these steps is blindingly obvious, then so is the conclusion. Over time, animals should change. So why don't we see it? Why does a dog always give birth to a dog, and a horse always gives birth to a horse? Well, natural selection doesn't suggest they shouldn't. What natural selection tells us is that a horse will always give birth to a horse that's very slightly different. After thousands of generations, these differences add up. If you want an example of imperceptible changes, you once looked like this. Maybe now you look something like this. But you've probably looked in a mirror every day of your life. So when did this change take place? Did you notice it? Okay, let's accept that organisms do change over time. But how do we know they change into different species, a process known as speciation? I'll leave the evidence of speciation for the next video and look at this through the example of our hypotheticus. We've seen how it can grow taller over time in order to survive a change of climate. But there may be other ways of surviving. This hypotheticus, for example, may not be able to compete well for leaves, but because of its longer claws it can dig more easily for tubers, so it would have a better chance of survival and its genes would be passed on. The question is not whether the hypotheticus would change over time, but what could possibly stop these changes from happening. Each generational change may be tiny, but millions of years of accumulated change in a changing environment leads to two completely different animals. The question is whether their DNA would by then be so different that they could no longer breed. In the next video, we'll see if there's any physical evidence to give us the answer. Anti-evolutionists have other objections which come up time and again. Well, if you're imagining something like this, then obviously you can't. But using our theory of natural selection and breaking it down into evolutionary steps, it's easy to understand. Simple organisms would have a sensory system, like the amoeba, which can sense heat, cold, and chemicals. This could then evolve into a sensory system with a central processor, just like in insects. Individuals with better organized centralized nervous systems would be able to do more things and pass on this improved trait. The central processor would get bigger and better. Again, in stages. I won't spend time explaining the evolution of the eye here because there are a number of good videos on YouTube that do that job, including this one. No, evolution requires variation. If information is a fancy way of saying bigger ears, hairier bodies, and longer necks, then fine, we know that happens. We can see it. If information means miraculously adding completely new parts, then of course that doesn't happen, and we know why. In the next video I'll show the evidence that animals adapt existing morphology for new tasks. Trying to characterize evolution as an accident doesn't change what it is, or the evidence for it, and clearly there's nothing random about natural selection itself, because genes survive only if they're best suited to survive. Mutations are just the inevitable result of DNA that didn't make a perfect copy, and they're very common. The result is variation, not some science fiction army of mutant ninja turtles. In fact, there's new evidence that mutations don't play such an important role in natural selection, and this might be a good time to look at what we've learned since Darwin. At the time Darwin and Wallace published their paper on natural selection, Louis Pasteur was developing his pathogenic theory of medicine, the idea that germs cause disease. But it would be laughable to presume that biologists haven't learned anything new about pathogens since 1860. Of course, our knowledge has advanced. So why would our knowledge of evolution be any different? Biologists now know that mutations may not be the big engine of change. DNA can be changed by proteins which turn genes on and off, a process known as cis-regulation. Epigenetics is a huge field, but it drastically changes Darwin's premise that genes are just passively sitting there, being manipulated by environmental changes around them. Putting this very simply, biologists have discovered that DNA can exaggerate traits that are being naturally selected. Instead of being the slow and steady change that Darwin envisaged, evolution seems to happen in fits and starts. It's as if natural selection is occasionally turbocharged. Cis-regulation and epigenetics might explain why this happens. These and many other discoveries don't overturn the 19th century idea of natural selection any more than modern microbiology overturns the discoveries of Louis Pasteur, but they do show that Darwin's ideas were crude and incomplete. There's a lot more to the mechanism that drives evolution yet to be uncovered. Okay, so we've deduced from the comfort of our armchairs that evolution ought to happen. At least I hope so. Now it's time to do the research and see if these ideas are supported by physical evidence. Meet me in the next video. Previous videos showed how the Earth's sedimentary rocks are like the pages of a book, taking us back through time. 19th century geologists discovered that the lowest and oldest layers contained a small variety of very primitive marine species. Higher sedimentary layers held more varied and more complex creatures. The progression suggested that these animals didn't appear suddenly, but were gradually evolving. But there were sudden disappearances. This layer of rock, for example, marks a catastrophic mass extinction about 250 million years ago. The rocks below this line are full of marine fossils, but in the rocks above, they're all gone. There were 5 global mass extinctions we know of, each one wiping out between 50 and 95% of species. Each was followed by the gradual recolonization of the Earth by surviving organisms that again began to change and become more complex until the next mass extinction. If this increasing complexity really did mean some kind of evolution, we'd expect to see it in individual species as we track their fossils through millions of years of sedimentary rock. And we do. Either each species is suddenly being killed off, only to be replaced by the sudden appearance of something that's almost identical, or we're seeing the changing morphology of a single species through time. We'd also expect to see traces of an animal's evolutionary ancestry in its morphology today, and we do. Take a look at this skeleton of an ape's hand. It looks just like a human hand, except it's not. In fact, it's not an ape's hand either. It's a whale's hand, or at least what used to be a hand in its ancestral past and is now used as a flipper. The morphology of animals today is full of remnant body parts that have been changed and adapted, just as evolution predicts. In the video on natural selection, I showed how a hypothetical animal might evolve into 2 different species. At first, the 2 types would be able to reproduce, then reproduce with difficulty, and then not reproduce at all. We can't watch it happening in mammals today because it takes several thousand generations, but we can see snapshots of it frozen in time. Modern horses, for example, separated from zebras several million years ago. They can still reproduce, but with difficulty, because a horse's DNA has 64 chromosomes and a zebra's 44. When an offspring is produced, it's sterile, exactly what evolution would predict. An even better example is found around mountains, where a species evolves as it spreads geographically. Each species can interbreed with the one next to it, but the species at each end of the line can't interbreed with each other. Among organisms with very fast reproduction rates, such as bacteria and flies, separation into new species has indeed been seen. This, for example, is a flavobacterium that eats nylon. It was found in a waste outlet near a Japanese factory that produces the stuff. The problem is nylon was only invented in 1935 and is completely synthetic and undigestible to other bacteria. Does this fit perfectly with evolution, and they evolved because of a mutation sometime between the invention of nylon and their discovery 40 years later? The answer came when researchers kept a completely different bacterium in a similar nylon-rich environment, and the same mutation occurred. DNA research has only added to the overwhelming evidence of evolution, but it's also completely shaken up the evolutionary tree and shown in much greater detail which animals share a common ancestor and when they separated. Researchers are now manipulating DNA to discover a treasure trove of evolutionary information. It's long been known that ancestral traits buried deep inside DNA can get switched on by accident with very obvious results. But they can also now be deliberately switched on in research labs. Chickens, for example, don't have teeth, but their distant ancestors did, and the code for it is still buried in their DNA. Activate the right gene, and you get a chicken with teeth. One of the commonest misconceptions about evolution is that we never find a transitional form between one species and another. But the fossil record is full of animals changing from one kind into another. It's one of the reasons we know evolution happened. Every animal is a transition between what went before and what comes after. If you think we haven't captured the instantaneous moment that one species turns into another, that's because there isn't one. It's like asking, where's the intermediate form between this and this? We know that this species existed at one time and is now gone, and it seems to have been replaced by this species. We can scour the archives and dig up as many transitional photos of George Bush as we like, but we're never going to find a single shot of W changing from a baby into a man. What we will find are the various transitional forms in between. If you're talking about gaps in the record, sure, there are lots of them. This is all I could find when I googled images from the life of George Bush, so of course there are gaps. If I went on a digging expedition, I could probably find 100 more, but even if I had 1,000 chronologically spaced photos of George Bush, there would still be gaps in between. As I mentioned in the last video, we now know that evolution, just like the growth of George Bush, doesn't happen evenly. The few years in between this photo and this one mark very few changes, but there's been a huge change in the same period of time between this photo and this one. But even when evolution happens quickly, it's still not instantaneous. For some animals, we've got a very good fossil record, and the time gaps between fossils are small. This shows evolution very clearly. For other animals, the gaps are longer, and the record is far less complete. Yes, I get that a lot. A theory in scientific nomenclature is the highest form of proof you can get. To go any higher, you have to enter the realm of mathematics. In all the sciences, there's still a lot more to discover, a lot more to understand, and a lot more to explain, whether it's atomic theory, the theory of gravity, or the theory of evolution. These are all called theories. So if you don't understand what a theory is in scientific terms, then they're what you would call facts. And using common terminology, evolution is a fact. It's so much a fact that researchers now depend on evolutionary theory to study antibiotic resistance and crop pests and new diseases and to develop new drugs. Understanding evolution isn't just important for understanding our past, but our future. In previous videos, I've shown evidence of how the world around us was formed, but a fundamental question remains: how did we get here? The void has always been filled by fanciful stories. The Chinese believed a dragon goddess needed someone to talk to, so she formed humans out of clay from a riverbank. According to Jewish mythology, a god made a man out of clay and then fashioned a woman out of one of his ribs. Inuit mythology describes a raven god who filled the earth with pea pods, and one of these burst open to reveal the first man. But 150 years ago, one book shattered these myths and opened the door to a rational and evidence-based understanding of our origins. But while Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace jointly came up with the idea of natural selection, they parted company on whether this evolutionary mechanism could be applied to humans. Wallace formulated the idea that animals had evolved, but he couldn't compromise his belief that humans were the work of a deity. But Darwin caved to the inevitable conclusion and called it "my little heresy." The little heresy was first expounded not by Darwin, but by naturalist Thomas Huxley in an 1863 book called Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature. Huxley and his supporters had clear evidence of evolution in animals. What they lacked was direct physical evidence to show that evolution also applied to humans. The search was now on for what became known as the missing link, a fossil that was half human, half ape. We are, of course, all apes according to classification, but for the purpose of simplification, in this video I'll refer to human apes as humans and our common ancestor with chimpanzees as apes. It didn't take long for this new branch of science to find its first piece of evidence. Just 3 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species, the bones of what looked like an oddly deformed human were unearthed in the Neander Valley in Germany. Neanderthal man wasn't the missing link, but it did seem to be one of our archaic ancestors. In 1891, fossil bones from the first real archaic hominid, later called Homo erectus, were found on Java Island. And 32 years later, another Homo erectus skull, Peking man, was found in China. Neither of these fossils were the fabled missing link. They were closer to humans than apes. But they did spark the idea that modern humans may have evolved in Asia. Africa was also beginning to yield some valuable finds, including the Taung child, found in South Africa in 1924. The problem was these didn't fit with another discovery made 16 years earlier in southern England, Piltdown man. But as more fossils emerged from South Africa in the 1930s, it became clear that Piltdown man was the anomaly, not the Taung child. Piltdown man just didn't make any sense, either in its physiology or its geographical location. It only made sense in 1953, when the hoax was revealed. By then, the distribution of hominid fossils had given rise to two schools of thought on human origins: an African origin and a multi-regional origin, the idea that humans evolved from archaic hominids in different parts of the world. But over the next 40 years, paleoanthropologists uncovered the motherlode of hominid fossils. The idea of a missing link has long been relegated to the status of a quaint 19th century preoccupation. Finding fossils that link humans to ancestral apes isn't the problem. The problem is that East Africa has produced so many of them that paleoanthropologists are having a hard time sorting out which are our direct ancestors and which are the evolutionary dead ends. We find what we find in most animal species, a wealth of relatives. Some branched off and reached a dead end very quickly. Others evolved for hundreds of thousands of years before becoming extinct. So our family tree turns out to be very rich indeed. It's a bit like trying to find the next of kin of an orphaned baby and coming up not only with direct ancestors, but also their brothers, sisters, uncles, and cousins. But together, these hominid fossils tell a single story. As we work our way forward in time, just as expected, they become less ape-like and more human-like. Well, no one disputes that. But what species of ape? There's clear evidence that some of these apes could light fires and make tools and hunt with weapons. They walked on two legs. But they weren't human either. They had obvious ape characteristics, like arms longer than legs. And why do we see a clear progression through time of more ape-like creatures disappearing and more intelligent and more human-like species appearing in the sedimentary layers above? We never see a species disappearing to be replaced by something less intelligent and less human-like. That might be true in some cases, but not in all. And skull shape is only one characteristic that separates humans from apes. A more slender body form, larger brain size, walking on two legs, having opposable thumbs, these are all crucial human features that we see evolving gradually through time. Evolution from ape characteristics to human characteristics can also be found in the smallest details, from the shape of the pelvis to the thickness of tooth enamel. When the field of DNA opened up, paleoanthropology got its first big break. This completely new field of science would either confirm one of the mythical accounts of our instant creation, or it would confirm the evidence of slow evolution. And guess which one turned out to be right. Or is it? When geneticists investigated, they discovered that humans have only 46 chromosomes and all the other great apes have 48. So we couldn't have evolved directly from a common ape ancestor. Unless two pairs of chromosomes had fused. Well, there's only one way to find out. I'll let Dr. Ken Miller pick up the story.
So we can scan our genome, and you know what? If we don't find that chromosome, evolution's in trouble. Well, guess what? It's chromosome number 2.
Mitochondrial DNA tells us even more. It shows that our nearest relative in the animal kingdom is, exactly as the fossil evidence predicted, a great ape, the chimpanzee. And when did we last share a common ancestor? Around 5 million years ago, just before the date of the first ancestral hominid fossils. Mitochondrial DNA from a Neanderthal fossil has also been analysed. It's completely different to every type of modern human, and it shows that humans and Neanderthals last shared a common ancestor around 500,000 years ago. Mitochondrial DNA can only be passed from mother to child, and it mutates at a fairly regular rate. Let's say this woman's mitochondrial DNA develops a mutation, and let's mark it red. Her kids will share the same mutation, but only the girls will pass it on. Several generations later, another part of the mitochondrial DNA mutates. Let's give this one a blue code. Then another one mutates, a green code, then more mutations. Thousands of generations later, we can see a clear pattern. Closely related people share a lot of similar mutation markers. The less closely related they are, the fewer common mutations they share. But everyone shares the red mutation, which means they can all be traced back to a common female ancestor. And since geneticists know roughly the rate at which these mutations occur, they can work out roughly when and where she lived. The result coincided perfectly with the fossil evidence around 150,000 years ago in Africa. I've laid out the twists and turns of the last 150 years because science doesn't move in a straight line. Ideas are constantly being refined, updated, and amended as more evidence comes to light. There are no foregone conclusions and no preconceptions. Instead, we feel our way in a darkened room, collecting evidence and getting closer and closer to an understanding of the layout. When DNA analysis came along, it was as if a light had been switched on. Nothing in the DNA evidence contradicts what we find in the fossil evidence. Together, they give us the broad picture of our origins. In the next video, The Ancestry of Humans Made Easy, I'll show evidence of who these ancestors were and how they left their homeland to conquer the world. My last video, Human Evolution Made Easy, showed how mitochondrial DNA can be used to trace our most recent common matrilineal female ancestor, who lived about 150,000 years ago in Africa. But the same can be done for markers on the Y chromosome, which are only passed from father to son. Our most recent common male ancestor also lived in Africa, but much later, around 60,000 years ago. This video will look at what happened next, and how we know that these ancestors migrated out of Africa and the routes they took to colonize the world. To understand that evidence, we first need to understand these DNA markers. DNA consists of two intertwining strands, which are basically joined up chemicals called nucleotides. Just 4 different types of nucleotide are found on each strand: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. To glue the two strands together, adenine always pairs with thymine, and cytosine always pairs with guanine. That's just the nature of their chemical bonds. When DNA copies itself, the copies aren't always perfect. So sometimes the wrong nucleotide will be put in place, in this case adenine instead of cytosine. If that isn't corrected, the pairing nucleotide will also be wrong, so you've got yourself a mutation, a marker. If the marker is on mitochondrial DNA, that marker will be passed down through every female descendant without alteration. If it's on Y chromosome DNA, it'll be passed down through every male descendant without alteration. So if we find a marker in people today, we can trace it back through thousands of generations to find out when and where it started. Now imagine if all these people were migrating. This group stays put, this group moves north, and in this group, headed east, a baby boy is born with a unique marker on his Y chromosome. The baby grows up and has male children who also carry the same marker. As the group continues its migration, some tribes settle and others keep moving eastwards. Like a leaky boat, the movement leaves in its wake a trail of descendants with the red genetic marker. So by checking the DNA of people living today, we find those with the same genetic markers. This map shows the distribution of men with a marker on their Y chromosome called M130. We can wind this film backwards and follow the migration route they took, which was the first complete one out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. That was the basis for the study conducted by Spencer Wells and others in 2000, which involved collecting DNA samples from indigenous people all over the world. Wells found distinctive genetic markers and traced each back to its source, marked here by red circles. We're retracing the migration paths our ancestors took backwards through time, and this is where they started, once again in Africa. Because the mutations happen at a fairly regular rate, these ancestral markers can even be dated, so the timescale on this map marks the progress of each migration. Populations that stay put and don't migrate will, of course, have a lot more of these genetic markers. So it's not surprising that we find the greatest genetic diversity in Africa. But the greatest of all belongs to a people whose ancestral homeland once extended from South Africa to the Rift Valley. Wherever you're from in the world, whatever mitochondrial or Y chromosome DNA markers you have, you can trace your ancestry back to the people whose modern descendants are the San, the Bushmen, the living embodiment of all modern humans. DNA evidence coincides perfectly with climatological evidence that shows these migrations occurred when East Africa was wetter and the Sahara was a savanna. Humans followed migrating herds across it, but when the climate became drier, the Sahara turned to desert. Effectively, it slammed shut like a gate. When the Saharan climate improved again, DNA evidence, coincidentally, shows a second great migration. This was the big one. Our ancestors moved into the heart of Europe and Asia, then later across a land bridge into the Americas. Wherever they went, humans adapted to the climate and new diets. People moving into northern climates lost the melanin in their skins. Melanin inhibits the production of vitamin D by sunlight. That's no problem in sunny Africa, but a drawback in northern latitudes. As long as they were moving and opening up new territory, there was plenty of space for excess populations to expand. But around 20,000 years ago, the human diaspora had filled nearly every continent. Settled populations began to grow. What we learned in primary school is that Stone Age humans were hunter-gatherers living in small tribes. Then all of a sudden they discovered farming, settled down, built towns, and invented writing. But if humans have been around for over 100,000 years, why did they suddenly become civilized in different parts of the world at the same time? Archaeologists don't see civilization as something that appeared out of the blue, like a light suddenly banishing the darkness of the Stone Age. Instead, they see increasingly complex and hierarchical societies. In Europe and the Middle East, people were living in semi-permanent settlements 20,000 years before the first pyramids were built and 12,000 years before farming was discovered. They had art, culture, religion, medicine, and a growing technology. They mass-produced beads and mined obsidian and flint for export, then transported them over extensive trading routes. They crisscrossed the Mediterranean in trading boats, and far from having lives that were nasty, brutish, and short, most of them lived to be grandparents and enjoyed healthy food surpluses. Even 6,000 years before farming was introduced, people in northern Mesopotamia were living in sophisticated settlements. This is a temple complex dating back 11,000 years. Further south, a people called the Natufians were also living in permanent villages, and there's evidence they stored grain. But then came the next big change. In the Middle East, the climate dried. Whether people began planting crops because they'd become scarce in the wild, or whether scattered populations had to congregate around oases and rivers because water was scarce, whatever the case, farming seems to have begun out of necessity. Over several hundred years it took hold in Mesopotamia and the Yellow River Valley, apparently independently. It took 1,000 more years for the practice to spread via trade routes to the Indus Valley, the Nile Valley, and other parts of Eurasia. But the payoff from farming was huge. It opened the way for larger settlements, technological innovation, and accelerated trade and writing. The motivation of these megalithic and Neolithic people may always be debatable, but nothing contradicts the hard evidence of DNA. Tracing our ancestry uses exactly the same techniques used in determining paternity and convicting criminals. The DNA evidence also fits perfectly with the climatological and archaeological evidence. We have a lot more to learn, but we do at least know how we got here. And so we come to the present day, having traced our origins in this series all the way from the Big Bang. Of course, to use a cliché, this is all ancient history. But to those with a yearning to know who they are and where they came from, it's a history that made us who we are. To understand that, just look at Britain's oldest complete skeleton, 9,000-year-old Cheddar Man. In 1997, DNA was taken from the skeleton and compared to people from the area. They discovered one of Cheddar Man's direct descendants, a schoolteacher, living just half a mile from where the skeleton was found.
I think our children have more robust intelligence in questioning to be able to cope with looking at all the different theories that are out there. Looking at all the different theories that are out there.
I agree. I wish there was time for children to learn all the different theories. They were shaped by extraordinary people who decided to observe the stars, the rocks, life, heat, light, and matter with open minds. They made conclusions based on evidence, not their religious beliefs. Surely the knowledge they've handed down to us will never be kept from our children.
We have a revelation from one who says, I know everything, I've always been there, here's what happened in the past. So when we take that revelation, put on our set of glasses, and we look at the evidence, we can say, now I understand. Fossils couldn't have formed before sin, there was no death before sin, there was a global flood, that connects to geology.
What is the age of the earth? When did the creation actually occur? And of course, we're going to go to the Bible.
How we make advances in science is being open to all different perspectives, and that's all that we're calling for.
Let's qualify that. Fundamentalists don't advocate teaching all of the thousands of different perspectives that are out there, like the idea that the Earth is expanding, or that aliens from another planet helped build the pyramids. What they want is to be able to teach just one different perspective, and the fundamentalist lobby is running a well-targeted campaign to convince parents, not just in the United States but also in other countries, of two things: that creation science and intelligent design are science, and that there's a real debate about our origins going on within the scientific community. And let's face it, most people don't know that much about science or about what goes on within the scientific community. So the first thing to recognize and to be honest about is that this has nothing to do with science.
We take that revelation, put on our set of glasses.
As I explained in the last video, the scientific method made easy, starting with a conclusion and then looking for the evidence afterwards, shatters the first golden rule of science. It's not even the way our courts operate. If you know your conclusion in advance, why even bother looking at the evidence? Any kind of scientific research becomes futile. This is so obvious even to non-scientists that advocates of creation science soon realized it wasn't a great way to break into the science curriculum, so the label was dropped in favor of something that was much vaguer, but sounded more thoughtful. Intelligent design takes a simple two-step approach. Find something complicated that we don't yet understand, and conclude that because we don't understand it, the best explanation is to assume the work of an invisible being, or to put it in a way that sounds a little more scientific, an intelligent designer. In fact, researchers who've applied the scientific method to these supposedly intractable problems have discovered their origins consistent with what we know and understand, even for things that seem to be very unintelligently designed. But even if they hadn't, this leap from problem to conclusion is not how science works. As we saw in the last video on the scientific method, real scientists investigate things we don't understand, however complicated, until they come up with a workable hypothesis. Based on that hypothesis, they then make a prediction that's rigorously tested. Only when a hypothesis has been successfully tested can a conclusion be reached. Advocates of intelligent design aren't prepared to make predictions, let alone test them, so it's not science. Maybe not even a hypothesis, because intelligent design doesn't explain the process by which organisms were designed and made. It would be just as useful to say it all happened by magic. So the two sides of this supposed debate are beginning to look decidedly unequal. The theory of intelligent design isn't a theory at all, it's an untested idea. And we never include untested ideas in the school science curriculum, not only because they haven't been reviewed or verified or derived by the scientific method, but because there are so many untested ideas out there that fill the entire science curriculum. As for the notion that the scientific community is divided, okay, on one side we have biologists, including many Christian, Muslim, Jewish and Hindu biologists who accept evolution, and on the other side we have biologists who believe in intelligent design. So the scientific community isn't divided over this question at all. There's an overwhelming consensus. The people who are calling for their ideas to be injected into the science curriculum are outside the scientific community and are happy to display a breathtaking ignorance of the subject they're tackling.
Somehow, that mud found a way to grow, reproduce, swim, crawl.
Somehow this happened? If Ben Stein is going to disagree with the theory of evolution, at least he has to understand how it works. People like Stein may have fallen asleep in biology class, but there's no excuse for denying our children a decent science education, insisting instead that they dumb down to our level of ignorance. And should we really be telling children that if they come up against a problem as scientists, they shouldn't try to investigate or resolve it? It's okay to assume it's the work of an invisible being. How far would that have got us in the last 500 years? In the 16th century, this was a key piece of evidence for intelligent design. There was simply no way to explain it. How could each color know where it had to go in the rainbow, and how did they all know how to form a perfect semicircle together? The only way these colors could be put into such a perfect and regular pattern is if an intelligent designer was arranging them. Intelligent design, like creation science, makes scientific research futile, and not just in the field of biology. Intelligent design advocates like Kent Hovind define evolution as everything from the unfolding of the universe to the deposition of sedimentary rocks. Cosmology, geology, physics, archaeology, anything that goes against the literal interpretation of the Bible is under threat. So the aim of the intelligent design lobby isn't to open minds or look at all the different perspectives or both sides of an imaginary scientific debate. The aim is to make science look murky and indecisive and cast doubt on theories that are the foundation of our knowledge. The strengths of science are used against it. The willingness of scientists to admit errors, correct them, and to modify hypotheses is used as proof that they can get things wrong. The word theory, the highest form of proof you can get in science short of mathematics, is mistranslated into uncertainty. Slowly, the solid facts established by centuries of scientific study are eroded. If untested hypotheses are taught alongside verified theories, we're reducing the idea of science to just a barrowload of ideas and asking children to sort out for themselves which are facts based on evidence and which are conjecture. The result is confusion, vagueness, and disinterest. We're not opening young minds, we're emptying them. The intrusion into science teaching threatens a number of countries, but none more so than the United States. 100 years ago, the USA was admired as a technological powerhouse. In the technologies of the 20th century, the United States was unsurpassed. The reality of the 21st century is that new technologies have emerged and other countries are catching up. It may be hard to fathom, but children in these countries spend their time in science class actually learning about science. Teachers don't have to use up valuable time debating the role of an imaginary designer to placate a religious lobby or dilute scientific facts to conform to ancient religious texts. They're already preparing the next generation of scientists. Are we?
Who should you always trust first, God or the scientist? God, and I want you to remember that.
Here's a little murder mystery. One morning, police find the body of a murdered woman, her head bashed in by a clock. Its hands rest at 10 o'clock. Her broken watch shows the same time. A doctor arrives and estimates the time of death based on body temperature at between 9:45 and 10:15 the previous evening. Phone records show the woman made an emergency call at 9:57, but the line was then cut. So here's the question. What time was the woman killed? It's possible, of course, that one of these pieces of evidence is wrong. The phone company's records may be wrong. The clock may have been slow or fast or broken on another occasion. So it's very remotely possible that all the evidence is wrong. So what makes us confident that each piece of evidence is right? It's the fact that they all point to the same time. If each piece of evidence was wrong, then the times they point to would be all over the place. The fact that they all point to the same time is called consistency. Consistency is what turns an observation into evidence, and we all use it all the time to make deductions about what happened in the past. In the story of the Earth Made Easy, I showed 4 photographs and asked people to deduce which was the earthquake, the tornado, the hurricane, and the flood. I asked a lot of creationists to take the test, but they were either vague about their results or refused to tell me whether they got the right answer and how they derived it. I suppose an admission that we can work this out is an admission that we can work out what happened in the past. But it doesn't matter. I know they got the right answer, and we all know how they derived it. They looked for the same things any rational person looks for: consistency. If people living in this town told you this damage was caused by an earthquake, you wouldn't believe it. Why not? Because the limited extent of the damage is inconsistent with an earthquake, or a flood or a hurricane, come to that. But the single trail of destruction is consistent with the path of a tornado. And if we look closer, we'll discover that brick structures remain undamaged, also inconsistent with an earthquake, while lighter objects have been strewn all over the place. So it really doesn't matter what our eyewitnesses claim. Maybe they were mistaken, or maybe they were lying, or maybe they're delusional. Eyewitnesses often get things wrong, but the evidence doesn't lie. We're intelligent enough to work things out for ourselves. Throughout this series, which took us from the beginning of our universe to the human migration out of Africa, through all of this the evidence has been consistent. All of the millions of pieces of individual evidence that form the hundreds of theories in dozens of different scientific fields, each and all are consistent with a single time frame and with each other. So the argument creationists use to suggest how one piece of evidence might possibly be wrong can't override one unanswerable fact, that all the scientific evidence is consistent. And none of the evidence is even remotely consistent with the universe, Earth, and every living thing in it being instantly created 6,000 years ago. So where an imaginary God was there to explain all the gaps in our knowledge, as we learn more about how the world works and how we got here, the role of this deity diminishes until it finds a place beyond the current extent of our knowledge, inside the Big Bang. Cosmologists admit that they don't yet know what caused the Big Bang. I don't mind people telling me that their religion does have the answer and that it's the absolute unassailable truth. But if that's the case, then let's have the details. Whatever lurks inside the world of quantum physics and singularity can't be masculine or feminine. So what is this God thing? What did it do to cause the Big Bang? How did it all happen? If you don't know, then you really don't know much more than I do. The plain fact is that none of us yet knows, so let's stop pretending we do. Sitting round arguing about what we don't know is like ancient Greeks trying to use philosophy to work out what powers the sun. But one thing we do know is that we can't use the Bible or the Quran as evidence, because the evidence we can see shows that these books are erroneous. Whatever it was that caused the Big Bang, we know from observations how the world has unfolded since then. There was no Garden of Eden, no man made out of clay and a woman made out of a rib. We know this because we can trace our origins very clearly back to Africa over 100,000 years ago. There was no instant creation of all the animals. We have overwhelming evidence that animals evolved over hundreds of millions of years. There was no global flood. We've dug and drilled through miles of rock stretching back billions of years, and the evidence for a worldwide flood 4,000 years ago just is not there. The universe was not made in a few days. It's nearly 14 billion years old, and we can see galaxies so far away that the light from them takes billions of years to reach us. And since we know all this, then we also know that the deity described in these holy books is a myth, a Bronze Age guess aimed at explaining the yawning gaps in our knowledge 3,000 years ago. The problem is, these books have been believed for so long, it's difficult to wean people off them. And that makes for a dangerous world in which Bronze Age myths hold greater power over some leaders and some nations than rational thought. I'm not just talking about the obvious dangers of religious intolerance. The world is facing unprecedented environmental challenges in the 21st century. We can't act under the assumption that a benign being is watching over us and will make sure we come to no harm. Or worse, follow a book that tells us the ultimate destruction of our environment is the will of some invisible deity, and that the best way to save ourselves is not to try to fix the damage, but to pray to the deity. This has been the futile practice of humans for thousands of years, natives praying to a volcano god instead of taking to their canoes. I hope this series has shown why we can't afford to be complacent. If we assume the fate of our world is sealed and out of our hands, then it soon will be.